In part 2 of our look at Niccolò Paganini, we explore his rise as the first superstar musical performer. A showman, a brilliant composer, and abilities that some claim came from the devil himself.
Welcome to the second episode of Musical Footprints, the stories behind the stories of the greatest composers of classical music.
I'm Paul van Gelderop in Eindhoven, the Netherlands.
And I'm Steve Moretti in Ottawa, Canada.
So, Steve, our second episode of our Cross-Atlantic podcast. How are things on that side?
Pretty good, actually. I was in Ireland for a couple of weeks, and there was a real heat wave when it got almost to 20 Celsius. But it was a beautiful country and really enjoyed it. Now I'm back in Canada, and I'm diving into book 3 of my Song for Lost Kingdom series and finishing off the audiobook. So having a lot of fun over here.
All right, cool. You got any inspiration in Ireland for a new book?
Yeah, I think it's going to sneak into book 3. I haven't figured out how, but it's a fascinating country. The history, the people, the music, the beer, the whiskey, it just comes together very well. So I think I love Ireland.
Yeah, it is. It's a beautiful country. That sounds like you've been busy. Well, not really that. Nothing exciting really happening over here. Just generally working, some voice acting, some composition, and looking forward to starting my degree in Master of Fine Arts degree in a few months. So until then, just got to keep working. And finally, we have headed into autumn, so insane
cool
heat
down
waves
a
are
bit.
gone. Yeah, and it's really wet now. But okay, that's good. We got a lot of rain. So.
Perfect.
Nice indoor weather. So, Steve, last time we left Niccolò behind, I think in Lucca, early 1800s.
Yes, we did.
I'm sure he did things afterwards. What happened to our dear friend Niccolò after that?
Right. Well, I thought I would just do a little recap on where our story so far, and it basically around that time, 1805, he was actually becoming kind of a violin superstar. He was in the Republic of Lucca, which had become part of France in 1799 when Napoleon Bonaparte conquered it. And it was about 1805 when he decided to make his sister Elisa the Princess of Lucca. And he had a big ceremony for her on the 14th of July, 1805. But the people in Lucca weren't too impressed because she really wanted them to speak French and eat croissants and stuff like that. And so they didn't really like her. They called her La
That's
Madame.
A bit stereotypical, isn't it?
I don't know. I just made that up. But, in my research, she said they wanted to Frenchify them. So I'm not sure. I don't think they're eating French fries, but I'm pretty sure the language and the customs and things. But
yeah, probably.
They were stubborn Italians. I get that. But Paganini, I mean, he was about 20. He was in his early 20s there. And so he really wanted to impress the princess. And it was her brother's birthday. That is Napoleon's birthday. So apparently the story goes that he took his violin, he took the 2 middle strings out. And he said that the one on the left was the highest and the lowest strings. One represented the male, one represented the female. And he made up this whole love story, and he made this composition. And I think you've got a piece to sort of illustrate what he did with it.
That would be the Duo Vermeil. We're gonna listen to that for a moment. It's I didn't know that story. That makes listening to it a little bit more interesting. So here goes. Well, if you play that in two strings, then gotta say I'm pretty impressed.
Yeah, especially since he apparently improvised that while he was talking to her or performing. So that is impressive.
That is, yeah, I wouldn't be able to do that. That's really cool. Then, do we know if she liked it, or was maybe it wasn't French enough for
Yeah, she was eating her croissants at that point. So
her?
I'm not sure, but she certainly she did have a thing for Paganini in terms of I think recognizing his talent, and
Mm.
and so for the next couple of years he did everything he could to impress her. Even at one point, as we'll see, uh, uh, working with her husband, teaching him the violin. I'm not sure, he was more of a military guy, but they thought it would be a good idea if Niccolò spent time with him, teaching him the violin.
Learning a little culture.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's not bad. Everyone should know a little bit about music. So,
Yes.
so this would be around the same time when he was actually, apart from improvising stuff on two strings, he did, of course, write a lot of different music at that time. One of the surviving pieces of that time is the Sonata Napoleone. Unfortunately, I was not able to find an example of that. The problem is that with a lot of his work, Paganini is really known for his caprices. So most of his other work can be a slightly hard to come by. But what he did do at the time in Lucca was also compose the Lucca sonatas, and I do have an example of that. And I think I'm really curious to hear what you think of that. So let's have a listen. So that was the sixth of the Lucas sonatas. It's kind of curious what you make of that. How does that sound to you?
Yeah, when I listened to that, I was at first thinking kind of a Vivaldi type thing. And then I started thinking I could almost picture being in Marseille or in France and getting, it's like Paganini wanted to somehow be more French. I don't know why I think
Mm.
that, but it doesn't sound like his other work or his virtuosity is almost being held back because he's trying to impress Napoleon's sister. But that's just the image that I get is more of a formal kind of piece, a little bit more restrained, and it's like he's holding himself back.
Yeah, that's the same idea I got when I was listening to it. I noticed that the work, his work around that time, is very according to conventional standards at that time. While his later work, as we will hear, is a lot more vivacious, a lot more lively, brazen even. But his
Hmm.
compositions around that time seem to be very held back, very restrained. Um, to be honest, I prefer the brazen work myself, but everyone has
Well,
their
that's
own.
that's how he made his reputation. But
Yeah,
that
of
is still a
course.
beautiful piece of music that we just
It
played. So
is. Oh, absolutely. It's
yeah,
it's it's
yeah, yeah.
beautiful. So are many of the other pieces around that time. But the first time I listened to it, I just had trouble believing I was listening to a work by Paganini.
So basically, Paganini spent time with the Bonapartes. With although they weren't the Bonapartes, it's the Princess of Lucca, Princess Elisa, and her husband Felice. And but he eventually they ended up moving to Florence because they decided, Lucca wasn't enough, so they made her the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, and she decided to move everything to Florence, which is, you know, I mean, if you've ever toured Italy, you definitely want to put Florence on your
Yeah,
to-do
it's
list.
beautiful.
And Paganini followed them, but I think he got a little bored after a while, and he decided to kind of strike out on his own. And he played around Tuscany for about the next 8 years. Then he got up to he's still kind of in the northern. Italian regions, Parma and Genoa, and that kind of thing. And it was around this time that he got his first big break, which was in Milan at La Scala Opera House. And he really, I don't know what he did, but he set the house on fire, and people really started talking about him, at that point. And eventually his fame spread pretty much across Italy, which when I say Italy, it's mostly still northern Italy down to Rome, because southern Italy, where my ancestors are from, is kind of like the wild area. And technically it's part of Italy, but it wasn't sort of the core area where Paganini would have traveled. But it did reach the Pope, Leo XII, who gave him the Order of the Golden Spur, which is, if you're Catholic, that means you've basically been knighted for being a good Catholic, which is a bit weird because he was a gambler, he was a serial womanizer, and they were already starting to talk that maybe he made a little deal with the devil. So, but Leo overlooked all that, and he became, he got his knighthood.
Good old Leo. Always so forgiving.
So it was about this time that I think he was composing the caprices, although I don't think they were published till later. But at this point, part of Paganini's struggle was, as a performer, he couldn't find things difficult enough. So I think he started to write. And Paul, I guess that's what you would like to highlight at this point.
Yeah, well, the caprices are well, of course, they're his most well-known work. The caprices are still to this day considered to be some of the most technically challenging pieces for violin. But as we discussed in the previous episode as well, it was difficult for him to find inspiration and enough challenge in the music that he was playing. And he, at some point, ran into the work of Locatelli, who wrote The Art of the Violin. And inspired by this, Paganini started to write his own music and his own caprices for violin. Before I get into those, I want to play one of them. Well, I'm just going to hit the play button. I'm not going to play it myself. Just to get an idea of what these caprices were and why they are so famous still today. So this is the Fifth Caprice by Niccolò Paganini. So, Steve, you want to guess why these pieces are considered to be still technically challenging to this day? Yes. Any idea why?
Well, I can't even. I'm just trying to imagine how you even play something like that. And I was also just thinking, compared to that last piece that we heard, the sort of French-inspired restrained one, this is like, my God, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I think this is the real Paganini. I think the work that he wrote in Lucca. And for the orchestra is just, it's still music by Paganini, but it's not what he it's not his specialty, I think. So of course, one of the first things that you'll notice about this, that actually for the people who know this piece, they will also have heard that there were a few notes missing from the intro, because they were so high that the virtual instruments that I normally use to create these, they don't even register them. So that was one of the things about his abilities. He was able to pull everything out of the violin, pull it, push it to its technical boundaries. And that is one of the things why, one of the reasons why the caprices are still so popular and challenging these days. If you're going to start on the caprices, you're going to know, as a violinist, you're going to have to really pull out all the stops to be able to do that. And it's not just the speed. One of the things that is very typical of the caprices is that he uses a lot of really technically challenging hand positions, finger positions, moving very quickly across the neck. And that is the challenge, I think, for a lot of violinists attempting the caprices. When you start as a musician, when you start rehearsing a piece, the first thing you do is try to play it as slowly as possible. You have to be able to play every technical detail correctly and really audible. So you start off really,
Yeah.
really, really slow. And once you finally master the technical details, you start to pick up the pace a little bit. In this case, in the caprices, most of the caprices, that means upping the tempo a lot. And the challenge in this is that you have to be able to reach the tempo intended by the composer while still being able to fully perform every technical detail without it becoming some sort of mess of bumbling notes. So you have to imagine that this caprice that we just heard, every note of that would have been completely audible and distinct when Paganini was playing it. And if you can't do it like that, you're not playing it properly. So that was the
Yeah.
that's the technical demands and the difficulties in playing those caprices. They have a lot of technical challenges, and even when you've mastered those, you still have to be able to play it at the tempo that he intended. The third thing that is often not something that people think about when they think about playing music and rehearsing music is after you've mastered the technical demands and you've gotten it up to speed, the third and I feel most important aspect is to be able to put emotion into your playing.
And I guess one thing is interesting is that he was one of the first performers that performed without the music in front of him. He memorized
Yeah.
it. Well, he also wrote it. So, but you can almost imagine why, because given the speed, the virtuosity, putting the emotion in, he wouldn't really have the ability to have a sheet of paper in front of him. He was uh, totally, I think, just listening to that, you can almost picture him being so in tune with the music and his soul just kind of pouring out through his
I
violin.
wouldn't I wouldn't be surprised if he'd actually had his eyes closed during most of the performance because there's really no need to
Yeah,
look at any sheet music. He's not going to keep his eye on the violin because he's going to play it by touch, completely by finger memory.
yeah,
So yeah, that is
yeah.
amazingly impressive if you're able to do that. So that would probably explain why he became popular and why Leo gave him the golden spur medal thing order.
Yeah,
I want to
exactly.
play one more of the caprices just as a little bit of an offset to the previous one. This is the 16th. I've chosen some of the caprices that are not too well known because I want to highlight some other stuff as well for a change.
So I think this is just leads us to our next section, which is talking about him as a performer, and not just as a performer, but almost like a cult-like following. Um, and it's interesting because he, from the age of 23 until 46, which is a pretty
It
big
is.
chunk of your life, especially back then, he toured only in Italy. So he hadn't even started to go to the rest of Europe yet. And within Italy, he became was creating a buzz. It actually, though, if you trace it back, apparently his first tour was when he was only 13 years old, when he was also composing. So he'd been doing that for a while, but it was after he left Lucca that it all sort of came together. And apparently had a lot of female admirers who always wanted to see him play. And he was known to have the stare. He would stare at people, and men would kind of squirm a bit, and women would really squirm. So he was starting this. It's almost like he was a precursor to the kind of performers we see today, because he also apparently didn't really. He dressed always usually in black, but his hair was kind of unkempt. and he had this focus, and like you're saying, probably closing his eyes and performing on stage. And the other thing that was interesting is that his performances got so popular that the ticket prices started to go through the roof, which seems
Hmm.
kind of odd. And people found him to be mean. That's what they would say to him. He's mean because his ticket prices are so high. But that was mostly men calling him mean, and to women, it just made him actually even that much more attractive. So he kind of established this, first performer superstar
Hmm.
kind of persona, well before we wouldn't see anything like that again until Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley and people like that. So he was kind of paved the way for what was to come,
Hmm.
really in the 20th
Well, I
century.
think the whole idea of the ticket prices going up, I think it actually makes sense. I mean, the demand is increasing, and there is only so much Paganini in supply. So you can up the prices. People are gonna.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
supply
is.
and
Basically,
demand.
it is. I
Yeah.
mean, people are gonna pay it anyway. So why not? Might as well make a little money out of it.
So I think you have some examples of some of
Yeah, I
his.
think I think that the best example would be the Violin Concerto Number One, and that is considered to be one of the pieces wherein he really shows off his violin skills. I mean, of course, apart from the caprices, and I want to play. I want to play part of that violin concerto for a bit, and then I want to go into the some of the techniques he uses, which also explains why people would be really impressed with him playing. So that was the opening of the first violin concerto by Niccolò Paganini, and you can hear a little bit how when the solo violin comes in, that it's Niccolò. It's a very wild violin
Yeah,
part,
exactly.
and
Yeah.
it goes on to become a lot wilder. And what he does in this next piece, I will explain it after you hear it, is actually extremely impressive. This is an excerpt from the same violin concerto, the Allegro Maesteso. So, what you might be able to hear there is that he plays several notes at the same time. Most of the time, he plays two notes at the same time. That is what is called a double stop. And with a double stop, you play two strings at the same time, and both of the strings have different notes on them, creating an interval. they're quite often used in violin parts. But what he did is play so many double stops in such an enormously high tempo with so much range going over the entire neck of the violin. So that is why the violin concerto
Yeah.
is considered to be one of his masterpieces. Um, and I think at that point you can also hear the resemblance between this concerto and the caprices. I think he finally found his voice, and let it just completely rip free.
Yeah. Interesting too that he had this sort of lush orchestral background and introduction, almost like he wanted to contrast the past and where he was at. And I think it makes it, to me, more enjoyable to hear that kind of build up and then just see him kind of, like you say, just completely take off and explore, new techniques and things. But I enjoy it more hearing that kind of build up and that contrast. And you think that was deliberate, or?
I think he definitely grew and developed a lot as a composer. When I was looking at the sheet music for the first violin concerto, I did notice that he uses quite a large orchestra, including woodwinds and brass. But when you look at the parts that are most detailed, most work out, they tend to be the string parts. So it's either the solo violin or the first violins, second violins, viola. Um, they tend to be the most prominent, and the rest of the orchestra is mostly there to provide the harmony to his solo violin and sort of a rhythm
Yeah.
against which
Right.
his solo violin can be heard.
Interesting. So just to recap, at this point, he's still kind of in Italy. And if he's playing this kind of music, as we've heard, he's becoming well known. He's already been knighted by the Pope. And he decides, he's 45 years old. He's quite famous, but only in Italy. And I guess to the people in Lucca that are eating croissants, and I'm probably going to hear about that. But the rest of Europe really didn't really know much about him. And so he decided to go on tour, and he began with a concert in Vienna in August 1828. And it wasn't really long after that that, uh, you know, the rest of Europe kind of took notice, and he was quickly proclaimed the greatest violinist of his time. And over the next 6 years, he went to basically every major city in Germany, Poland, Bohemia, also went to France and Britain. And Frederick Chopin, excuse me, and Franz Liszt at some point heard him. I'm not sure where it was, but they heard him, and they were very inspired, and they wanted to try doing what he did with the violin, but doing it on the piano. And so I'm sure at future episodes we'll probably be exploring both of those guys. But it was this tour that really caught their attention as well as the rest of Europe. But he only did that for about 6 years, and then he started to develop a lot of different health issues. And he would also get depressed and apparently disappear for a day, a week, even a month before he'd kind of reemerge, because he's a bit of a tortured soul. He was an alcoholic from an early age, and he had lots of different health issues, as we'll sort of talk about. But he's kind of like this twisted, tortured genius, I guess, who was basically inspiring anyone that listened to him that had any kind of musical sense at all. Got inspiration from listening to him perform.
Yeah, I think the when his fame finally spread and his work was heard by other composers, they were very eager to work on that material. It's not very uncommon, especially not in those days, that a composer would use a theme of another composer and write their own variations on it, or use it to inspire a different piece. Some people may have heard of the Diabelli variations, or the Goldberg ones. It happens quite a lot. It was of course sort of a compliment, another composer considering your work to be an inspiration for theirs. And one of the most well known, I think, still is the Etude de Paganini by Franz Liszt, who basically took the music of Paganini and transcribed it to the piano, making it fiendishly difficult to play. Again, I've tried, I failed. But plenty of other people did that. Rachmaninoff, for example. I just want to. I think because I mentioned Liszt first, it would be fun to listen to a little example of that fiendishly difficult piece. We've actually heard this before in our previous episode, but I think it's just too cool not to listen to it again. So, as you can hear, this is, of course, based on one of the caprices. At least, basically, does the same thing on the piano that Paganini did on the violin. And when you're playing the piece, you're basically jumping back and forth, mostly with your right hand, which is not an easy feat because you have to play at an enormous tempo. And throughout the entire piece, you have to keep the rhythm constant. You have to make sure that every note is heard properly. So yeah, at least definitely, I think, did Paganini's work credit.
Just to continue on with our story, he finally, after this European tour, he kind of called it quits, and he things weren't great for him. He was, partially because of he also, he had a number of health issues and things like that. He had syphilis when he was diagnosed with syphilis about 30, and the prescription in those days was mercury and opium, which is not a great combination, and that's affected him. He was also diagnosed with tuberculosis, and he loved to gamble as much as he liked performing, I guess. And there was some rumors that he didn't want people to he wanted to keep his music secret, even though he performed it. But that's apparently not true. And he went to back to Italy for a while, and he spent most of his time publishing his music, his compositions, and his methods, detailing that. And he had some students. Some of them went on to become fairly renowned violinists. But then, for some reason, he's 54 years old, and he has this crazy idea. He's going to go to Paris and set up a casino, which he does because I guess he likes gambling. And immediately it fails. And it doesn't fail just a little bit. It fails to the point where he has nothing left. He's massively in debt, and he has to sell everything, including his musical instruments, which were basically probably his key possession. And a few years later, he ended up dying. So he kind of peaked after that tour, but fortunately went and did his composition and music publishing. But people were still thinking about him, and this whole devil mystique was growing up. And I wonder, do you have some examples of why we might think he was in league with the devil?
Well, I think we heard some examples of that earlier. I think that the reason people thought he was in league with the devil because they had never seen anyone perform the way that he did. Not only because of the no sheet music and the gaunt appearance, but also because of the amazing technical abilities that he had, which of course he spent a lifetime perfecting and practicing. And when you're writing your own music, which of course he did later in life mostly, you can write to your strengths. I think people got inspired by the whole sold his soul to the devil story because they didn't believe that a man was capable of playing the music that he was playing. But to say that he sold his soul to the devil, I don't know. It is a little bit far fetched. I think he was just an enormous prodigy. I think the syndromes that we discussed in the first episode also may have helped him in that way, especially when he was a young child developing. And he was just an amazing musician.
Yeah, there was also some other interesting points. There was a story that because he was a serial womanizer, he just was with one woman after another, and there was this rumor that he murdered one of his girlfriends, took out her intestines, and used them as violin strings, and imprisoned her soul inside of his instrument. And there was people that said that they could actually hear her crying out when he performed on stage. Of course, this would add to the general rumor and want people to even go to more people to go to his concerts. He was also tall. He was thin. He had pale skin, thin lips. His cheeks were hollow, and people could swear they could see the devil on stage, or if not on stage, the devil helping him. And then people started talking about they could see horns and hoofs kind of growing out of him. So the stories kind of multiplied on themselves. And there was also a claim that someone saw lightning strike the end of his bow while he was performing. So all of these stories, along with a rumor that perhaps his mother made a deal with the devil when he was very young, that he would be the greatest violinist in history. None of these are really true, but they sound great for publicity. And not that I don't think he did it deliberately, but I don't think he discouraged it either. So, but the other thing is, once you got in the concert hall, then all those rumors, were maybe just a way to get you in the hall. But then you saw him perform, and you realized whether he was in the league with the devil or not, he was an amazing performer, and that's, I think, what we still remember to this day.
He is still considered to be one of the fathers of the modern violin technique, because a lot of the techniques and articulations that he used have become common practice these days. And apart from that, his music, as we said earlier, inspired a lot of other composers, both in his days. We had Liszt, of course. I think that is the sort of legacy that, as a musician, you can be really proud of, when other great musicians consider your work to be an inspiration and want to build on that. I think that's definitely a sign that you have achieved greatness, not just with the general public, but also with other great composers. I want to play a little bit from the piece of Rachmaninoff, for one of the reasons that I am a big fan of Rachmaninoff's work. And this is the Rhapsody on Variation of a Theme by Paganini.
Yeah, it almost seems like an ode to Paganini, a little like a tribute.
It is. I mean, most of these compositions are meant to be a tribute to the composer, to the music that they wrote.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you very much for listening. Next episode, episode 3, we'll be looking at one of your favorite composers, Edvard Grieg. And can you just give us a quick snapshot of who we're going to be looking at?
Well, Grieg was a very different sort of person than Niccolò Paganini. So he was a composer from Norway, and he composed amazing music and also music that some people may not know his name, but I can guarantee you that you will have heard his work, as you'll hear in the next episode.
Great. Well, we'll be diving into his life and his music in episode 3. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and just be sure to visit our website, musicalfootprints.com, and you can download the show notes and also a list of all the musical pieces that we use on these on each episode. So I hope you'll take the time to check out our website and leave us a review too on the different podcasting services where you are downloading this podcast from. This is Steve Moretti. Thank you for listening.
Until next time, this is Paul Vergelderop signing off with the music of Niccolò Paganini, another excerpt from the first violin concerto.